Anyway, welcome to Paper Cuts, everybody. Sorry, I needed to have 15 seconds of silence to cut out the fan. If I did it right, the people listening to the recording should be able to hear it about as much as the people watching the stream can hear it, thanks to the noise gating, at least when it's quiet. Let's begin. Our story this evening is The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station, and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses, more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire! In the name of human charity, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook the snow off himself in the bar, and followed Miss Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, and that and a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Miss Hall lit the fire and left him right there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Iping in the winter time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlor, and began to lay them with the utmost eclat. Hang on, I need to find out if I'm pronouncing that right. It's E-C-L-A-T. Eclat? That's an A with an umlaut? I guess that's It's like, it's an A sound with like, with like O lips, if I remember right. I don't remember exactly how umlauts work. Eclat. She began to lay them with the utmost eclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow still sprinkled his shoulders, dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir, and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said, without turning. She wasn't sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. And at this he turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with sidelights, and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir, as you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again, and Miss Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato, and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and didn't stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirk, 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 it went, the sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked round a basin. "That girl! There, I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. She'd cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon a gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly, and as she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking up something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened to rust her steel fender. She went to those things resolutely. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning, she saw that he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth. It was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaw were completely hidden, and that was the reason of his muffled voice. But it wasn't that which startled Miss Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink peaked nose. It was bright pink and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high black linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He didn't remove the serviette, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown-gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received, and she placed the hat on the chair, again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir, that... well..." She stopped herself there, plainly embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door, and then at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white-swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "I never... there." She went quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now, when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, and then rose, taking the serviette in his hand, and walked across the room and pulled the blind down at the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight, and with this done he returned with an easier air to the table, and by extension his meal. "The poor soul's had an accident or an operation or something," said Miss Hall. "What a turn them bandages did give me, to be sure!" She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveller's coat upon this. "And their goggles, why, he looked more like a diving helmet than a human man." She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, and holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt, too, maybe. She turned round as one who suddenly remembers. "Bless my soul alive, aren't you done with them taters yet, Milly?" When Miss Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must have also been cut or disfigured in the accident, she supposed him to have suffered. Oh, pardon me. As I was saying, when Miss Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe all the time that she was in the room, He never loosened the silk muffler that he had wrapped round the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it wasn't forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drank and been comfortably warmed through with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles that they lacked hitherto. "I have some luggage at Bramblehurst Station," and he asked her now that he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. "Tomorrow? Are you sure there's no speedier delivery?" And he seemed quite disappointed when she answered no. Was she quite sure? No man with a trap who would go over? Miss Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. "It's a steep road by the downs, sir," she said, and answered the question about a trap, and then, snatching at an opening, said, "It was there a carriage was upsettled a year ago, and then some. A gentleman was killed, believe it or not, besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, they happen in a moment, don't they?" But the visitor wasn't to be drawn so easily. "They do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly, once more through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they? Oh, there was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it in the hayfield. Bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. It's given me dread of a scythe, sir." "I can quite understand that." "He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. He was that bad, sir." The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. "Huh! Was he?" "He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had the doing for him, as I had, my sister being took up with her little ones so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that if I may make myself so bold as to say it, sir." "Will you get me some matches?" said the visitor, quite abruptly. "My pipe is out." Miss Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, and then remembered the 2 sovereigns, and went for the matches. "Thank you," he said concisely, as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her, and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She didn't make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice a curious listener might have heard him at the coals, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audibly pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself, and then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Sorry, I wanted to get a really extended bit of silence there, just for the recording's sake. Give me a moment. I'm gonna pause the recording and have a little drink of water. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Miss Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Miss Hall, but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. "Alright, clock jobber, what's that mean? What do we got here? Oop. Alright, what does my reader tell me? Not visitor, clock jobber, please. If you could. No, tell me about clock jobber. Tell me about a clock jobber. Tell me about a clock jobber. Come on, let me click on the word. Okay, it's not let me click on the word. I guess we're not going to learn what clock jobber means. Goodness gracious. There we get. Clock jobber, no definition found. Sorry. I mean, if either of you in the chat know, feel free to type at me and let me know. Or heck, even if either of you in the chat would like to Google it for me, feel free. Miss Hall agreed with him and then noticed he had his bag with him. Now you're here, Mr. Teddy, I'd be glad if you give the old clock in the parlor a bit of a look. It's going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. Okay, so a clock jobber is probably someone who just, does jobs with clocks, fixes clocks. Intricate work. And so, leading the way, she went across to the parlor door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and, indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. And then he started up in his chair, and put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from a momentary shock. "Look at the clock?" he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then, shaking himself more fully awake, "Well, certainly." Miss Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. And then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, as they say, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope that it's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger. "Though I understand," he said, turning to Miss Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir, you'd prefer the clock." "Certainly, but as a rule I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I am really glad to have this clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. "And presently, when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea. But not until the clock mending is over, mind you." Miss Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she didn't want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey, when her visitor asked her if she'd made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she'd mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You're certain that's the earliest?" She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I'm an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir." "And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances." "Very useful things indeed they are, sir."
and I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries.
Of course, sir.
My reason for coming to Ipning, well,
He proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner,
was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident
I thought as much.
necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes, they're sometimes so weak and painful, I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours altogether. Lock myself up. Oh, sometimes, now and then, not at present certainly, but at such times the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, it's a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It's well that you understand these things.
Well, certainly, sir, and if I might make so bold as to ask,
That is, I think, all,
said the stranger with a quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Miss Hall once again reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Miss Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, as Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with this stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, gray and dim, was the bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Mr. Henley that, well, for a minute they remained staring blankly at another. Then Henfrey looked down again. What an uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold for the time of year? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot.
The weather. Why don't you finish and go?
Said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage.
All you've got to do is fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging.
Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked. And Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he went feeling excessively annoyed. He trudged down to the village through the thawing snow, swearing to himself. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And yet again, can't a man look at you? How ugly. Well, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more whopped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Ipping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming toward him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving.
"My hello, Teddy."
You gotta run.
Yeah, you gotta run my boat.
Hall very sociably pulled up.
What's that? Rum-looking customer stopping a Coach and Horses. My sakes.
And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of the grotesque guest.
It looks like a bit of a disguise, don't it?
I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place, but I suppose women are that trustful where strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms and he hasn't even given a name, Hall.
You don't say so.
Yeah, by the week. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones and boxes, Hall. He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with an empty portmanteau. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl. I suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown had germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall in spite of these discouragements. "You don't know anything," said Mr. Hall, and resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't the master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Miss Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall, and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of indeterminable necks and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3. The 1,001 Bottles. So it was on that 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity onto the Ippling village. The next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks, indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition there was a box of books, huge fat books, of which there were in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw. Glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in a hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fairnside's cart, while Hall was having a word or two of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fearenside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes." Hang on, oh, that's the guy.
"Come along with those boxes. I've been waiting long enough."
And he came down the steps toward the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fearenside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps it gave an undecided hop, and then sprang straight at his hand. "What?" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs, and Fearenside howled, "Lie down!" and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, and saw the dog execute a flanking jump, and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fearenside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift 30 seconds. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the ladder, and then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute, you!" said Fearenside, climbing off the wagon with whip in hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "You'd better come here." Hall had stood gaping. "He was bit. I'd better go see to him." And he trotted after the stranger. He met Miss Hall in the passage. "The carrier's dog bit him." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and entered without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down and the room dim. he caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. There he stood on that dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of moments after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the Coach and Horses. And there was Fear-Inside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Miss Hall saying his dog didn't have any business biting her guests. There was Huckster, the general dealer from the road, that he was interrogative, and Sandy Wadgers from the forge, judicial. Besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. So, I wouldn't let him bite me, I know. That's just right, have doors, what am I for then? So forth and so on. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he'd seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "He didn't want no help, he says," he said in answer to his wife's inquiry. "We'd better be taking of his luggage in." You ought to have it cauterized all at once, especially if it's all inflamed. "I'd shoot him, that's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. And suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along," said an angry voice.
Come along,
cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down.
"The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased."
It's stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed. "Was you hurt, sir? I'm rare sorry to the
"Not a bit. Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things."
He then swore to himself, so Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor, and the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness, and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Miss Hall's carpet. And from it he began to produce bottles. Little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst couldn't boast half so many, and it was quite a sight. Crate after crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates beside the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. And when Miss Hall took his dinner into him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes, that he didn't hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table. With some little emphasis, perhaps, seeing the state the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her.
"I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking,"
he said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly—"
"Perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you."
"Oh, certainly, sir, if you— well, I suppose you can turn the lock if you're like that, any time."
"It's a very good idea.
This drawer, sir, if I might be so bold as to make a remark.
Don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill.
And he mumbled at her, words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd standing there, aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Miss Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. In which case I should like to know, sir, what you consider...
A shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough.
So be it, said Miss Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course. At this he turned and sat down with his coat collar toward her. And all the afternoon he worked with the door locked and, as Miss Hall testified, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock.
I can't go on. I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude. Cheated. All my life it may take me patience. Patience indeed. Fool. Fool.
There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Miss Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it.
Put it down in the bill, snapped the visitor. For heaven's sake, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it down in the bill.
And he went on, ticking a list in the exercise book before him. I'll tell you something, said Fearinside mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Ippling Hanger. Well, this chap you're speaking of my dog, but, he's black. Leastways his legs are. I see through the tear of his trousers and tear of his glove. You'd expected a sort of, pink skin to show, wouldn't you? There wasn't none. Just darkness, I'm telling you. He's black as my hat. Wow, that didn't age well. My sakes, it's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is pink as paint. That's true, I knows that. I tell you what I'm thinking. That man's got the, what do you call it? Vitiligo, Teddy. Black here and white there in patches, and he's ashamed of it. Yeah, I suppose I've heard of such things before. It's a common way with horses. I don't suppose why a person couldn't have something like that. Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I've told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Ipping with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But excepting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very cursorily. Cursorily, that's the word I'm looking for. The circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very cursorily. There were a number of skirmishes with Miss Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall didn't like him, and whenever he dared, he talked to the advisability of getting rid of him, but he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously, and avoiding his visitors as much as possible. Wait until the summer, said Miss Hall sagely, when the Arctics are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but the bill's settled. Punctual is bill's settled punctual. Whatever you'd like to say. The stranger didn't go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days, even in costume. He worked, as Miss Hall thought, very fitfully, Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Miss Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what he said. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest paths and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going labourers, and Teddy Henfrey, stumbling out of the Scarlet Coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking, hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened inn door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse, but there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in a village such as Iping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Miss Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she could say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew things such as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing there was a view largely entertained that he was a criminal trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. No crime of any magnitude, dating from the middle or end of February, was known to have occurred, and elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gold, the probationary assistant at the National School, this theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted, for the most part, in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him. But he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fearendside, and either accepted the vitiligo view or some modification of it, as, for instance, Silence Durgan, who was heard to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he'd make his fortune in no time, and, being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as simply a harmless lunatic. That had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups there were waverers and compromisers. Sussex folk have few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village, and even then it was only credited among the womenfolk. But whatever they thought of him, people in Iping, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain-worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them. That's very strangely worded. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them, round quiet corners, The inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closings of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who would agree with such goings-on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he'd gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him, in an imitation of his occult bearing. There was a song popular at that time called the Boogeyman. Miss Stachel sang it at the schoolroom concert in the age of the church lamps. And thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together, and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also, belated little children would call Boogeyman after him, and make off tremendously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of the 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. And all through April and May, he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, toward Whitsuntide, he could stand no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall didn't know his guest's name. "He gave a name," said Miss Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded, "but I didn't rightly hear it." She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and the door closed and cut Miss Hall off from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and then Cuss appeared, his face pale white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and, without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor, and then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She couldn't see his face where he stood, and the parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up to the village, to Bunting the vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began, as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What's happened?" said the vicar, putting on the ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn." "Well?" "Give me something to drink," Cuss said, and sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he'd just had. "I went in and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He stuck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair, and he sniffed. I told him I had heard he took an interest in scientific things, and he said yes, and sniffed again. Kept on sniffing all the time, evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, ballads, test tubes and stands, and a smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank what he was researching. Said he was a long research. He got quite cross. "A damnable long research," said he, blowing the cork out, so to speak. "Oh," said I, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled him over. He'd been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. For what he wouldn't say. Was it medical? "What are you fishing after?" I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough, and he resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients. Put it down and turned his head. Draught of air from window lifted the paper. Swish rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was the prescription, burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it just as it whisked up the chimney. So just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. "Well?" "No hand. Just an empty sleeve. Oh. Heavens, I thought, that's a deformity. He's got a cork dark arm, I suppose, taking it off. And then I thought there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps the sleeve up and open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing. There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it. Right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through a tear of the cloth. Good heavens, I said, and then he stopped. He stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. I was saying that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I? He said and in an interrogative cough. How the devil, said I, can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty... It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve? He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood up quite close. He sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though I'm hanged if that bandage knob of his and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve? Yes, certainly. And he stared at me. He said nothing. A bare face, unspectacled, he starts scratching. Then very quietly he pulls his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm toward me as though he would show it to me again. He did it again, very, very slowly. I looked at it and it seemed an age. Well, there's nothing in it. I had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, just like this, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. It was a strange thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something exactly like a finger and thumb it felt. It nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh at this. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you I was so startled I hit his cuff hard and turned around and cut out of the room. I left him. At this Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned round in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent vicar's very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm, there wasn't even a ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought this over, and he looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a remarkable story, he said, and looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really a most remarkable story, said Mr. Bunting. Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Epping to the club festivities. Miss Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with a strong impression that the door of their bedroom had been opened and closed. Ooh. Oh, sorry. Sometimes you just gotta yawn. She didn't arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed, listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing-room and walking along the passage toward the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as soon as possible and as quietly as she could. He didn't strike a light, but he put on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers. He went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Miss Bunting then came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread, and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped, the drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open drawer and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he couldn't see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Miss Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident of the village. They heard the clink of money, and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2 10 and half sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Miss Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stopped, amazed. Apparently, the room was perfectly empty. And yet their conviction that they had, at that very moment, heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping, and then Miss Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Miss Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Miss Bunting scrutinized the waste-paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn. The candle. Who lit the candle?" "The drawer, and the money's gone." She went hastily to the doorway. "Of all the strange occurrences." There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did, so the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He's certain that nothing went out of the door. It stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Miss Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared, and it was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the pantry, kitchen, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. And with this daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Alright, with that, we're about an hour in. We got about 2 minutes, but we are at a chapter boundary. I would firmly suggest for all involved that you take this time to, if you're listening to the recording, pause the video. If you're watching the stream, feel free to minimize the window. I am going to go walk about for a few moments, stretch, get the blood moving. If you've been sitting for an hour, it's always a good idea. I'm going to probably go get some more water, and I would suggest you also do that, I think hydration, I have an automated hydration reminder in my Twitch chat, and it tells you you're supposed to drink about 8 ounces of water per hour of stream. So if you've been listening, now would be a good time to go get a glass of water, I suppose. Maybe grab some snacks if you've got the calories available for the day. I'm going to go do that. I will be right back. Let's dive right back in with Chapter 6, The Furniture That Went Mad. Now, it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Millie was hunted out for the day, Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Miss Hall found that she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room, and as she was the expert and principal operator in the affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. And on the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went into his own room and found the bottle as he'd been directed, but returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch. And with a flash of inspiration, he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Miss Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, and then, with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty. And what was stranger even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depth of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note, by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. "George, you got what a wild..." That's absolutely not how it sounds, but oh well. At that he turned and hurried down to her. "Jenny," he said over the rail of the cellar steps, "that's the truth what dear Harry says. He's not there's a room in, and the front door's unbolted." At first Miss Hall didn't understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "It ain't there, it's close there. And what you doing without his clothes in? It's the most curious business." As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied they heard the front door open and shut. But seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Miss Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase, and Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood, regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow, and then under the clothes. "Cold. He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Miss Hall's face. And then as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Miss Hall. It seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Miss Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Milly, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. There's spirits. I know there's spirits. I read in the papers of chairs and tables leaping and dancing. Take a drop more, Danny. It'll twitty you." Lock him out. Don't let him come in again. I half guessed I might have known. With them goggling eyes and bandaged head and never go to church on a Sunday and all them bottles more than it's right for anyone to have. You put the spirits in the furniture, my good old furniture. 'Twasn't that very dear chair my dear old mother used to sit when I was a little girl. Should think it should rise up against me now. Just a drab more, Danny. Your nerves is all upset. And they sent Millie across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinarily. Would Mr. Wadgers came around? He was a knowing man, Mr. Wadgers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. I'm darned if that ain't witchcraft, was the view of Mr. Sandy Wadgers. You aren't her shoes for such use as he. He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion, and Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for a parliamentary government asserted itself, and there was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. Let's have the facts first. Let's be sure we be acting perfectly right and busting that there door open. A door unbust is always open to busting, but you can't unbust a door once you bust it in. And suddenly, and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time, and he walked across the passage, still staring, and then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger, and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor, and swiftly, suddenly, viciously, slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away, and they stared at one another. "Well, if that don't work anything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. "That'd go in a nice for that'd burn an explanation," said Wadgers to Mr. Hall. It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch, and at last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, and "shut the door after you." So that brief interview terminated. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, the third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "You must go to the devil indeed," said Miss Hall, and presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage. Hang on, I'm getting distracted by something. What is this? And why? Oh, that's what that is. Probably, maybe, hopefully. That or I'm sticking my foot into a spider web. Nope, that's what that is. Anyway, sorry, I got distracted. Where was I? Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Wadgers, went off to find Mr. Shackleford, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself was unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Miss Huckster came over. Some young fellows, resplendent in black ready-made jackets and peak paper ties, for it was Whit Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Ipling youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both gender putting up a coconut shy? What? What's a coconut shy? Yeah. It's a coconut, but what's a coconut shy? I don't know. If someone in the chat knows, please feel free to inform me. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons, and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Wadger of the Purple Fawn and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which originally had celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee, across the road. And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, pored through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible, if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of 6 smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time and what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar.
"Miss Hall,"
he said, and someone went sheepishly and called for Miss Hall. Miss Hall appeared after an interval, a bit short of breath, but all the fiercer for it. Hall was still out, and she had deliberated over this scene. She came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Is this your bill you're wanting, sir?"
"Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?"
"Why isn't my bill paid? That's what I want to know."
"I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance."
"I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await any sort of remittance. You can't grumble if breakfast waits a bit, if my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly, and there was a rabble from the bar. "I'd thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself." The stranger stood, looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Miss Hall had the better of him, and his next words showed as much.
"Look here, my good woman."
"Don't good woman me."
"I told you my remittance hasn't come."
"Remittance indeed."
"Still, I dare say in my pocket."
"You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you."
"Well, I found some more."
"Hello," came from the bar. "I wonder where you found it." That seemed to annoy the stranger very much, and he stamped his foot.
What do you mean?"
"That I wonder where you found it. And before I take any bills or get any breakfast or do any such things whatsoever, you gotta tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody does understand, and what everybody's very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how your room was empty and how you got in again. Them's as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do, and what I want to know is how you did come in, and I want to know—" Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot again, and said, "Stop!" with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly.
You do not understand who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you."
And then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity.
"Here,"
he said, and stepped forward and handed Miss Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. And then when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose! It was the stranger's nose. Pink and shining, it rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles. I take mine off, but I don't like to do that on camera. Then he removed his spectacle, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him, and a flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh my God," said someone, and then off they came. It was worse than anything. Miss Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps, and for the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid, gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness, no visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing at its humanity. They saw Miss Hall fall down and Mr. Teddy Humphrey jump to avoid tumbling over her, and then they heard the frightful screams of Millie, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith everyone all down the street, the sweet-stuff seller, the coconut-shy proprietor and his assistant, the swingmen, the little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, aproned folks, aproned travelers, I suppose would be the best word there. Aproned travelers began running toward the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in the front of Miss Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once. And the result was babble. A small group supported Miss Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference in the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "A boogie! What's he been doing then? Ain't that the girl, has he? Running at him with a knife for her to use. No, I tell you, I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean man without a head. Nonsense, it's some kind of a trick. First off, very pretty big." In its struggles to see in through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with a more adventurous apex nearest the inn. "He stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring, not a moment ago. He went in there, I tell you, he ain't got no head at all. You just missed it." There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely toward the house. First Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Wadgers. They had come now, armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlor, and flung it open. "Constable." What was this guy's voice? "Constable. That's not it, either. Constable, do your duty." Jaffers marched in, and Hall after, and Wedgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure, facing them with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him." What the devil's this?" came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a rum customer, mister. But head or no head, the warrant says body, and duty's duty." "Keep off," said the figure, starting back. Abruptly he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffer's face. In another moment Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding across the table to Wadgers, who acted as a goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered toward him, clutching and hitting in. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together.
"Get the feet,"
said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wadger, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and the Sidderbridge carter, coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier. Dang, that's a real tongue twister of a word. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungency into the air of the room.
"I'll surrender,"
cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now as well as his left.
"It's no good,"
he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space, but Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and introduced a pair of handcuffs, and then he stared.
"I say,"
said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim recognition of the incongruity of the whole business.
"I can't use 'em when I can't see."
The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle, the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down, and he seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks.
"Why, that's not bad at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the lining of his clothes. I can put my arm—"
And he extended his hand, but it seemed to meet something in mid-air, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation.
"I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye,"
said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expostulation.
"The fact is, I'm all here. Head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it, but it happens that I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Ipping. Is it?"
The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the men had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded.
"Invisible, eh? Who ever heard the likes of that?" "Well, it's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why?"
Oh, wait, no. That is I started it in the dude's voice, and it is the invisible dude's voice.
"It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?"
That's a different matter. No doubt you're a bit difficult to see in this light, but I've got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after isn't any invisibility, it's burglary. There has been a house broken into and money taken."
"Well?"
"And circumstances certainly point—"
"Stuff and nonsense."
"I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions."
"Well, I'll come. No handcuffs."
"It's the regular thing."
"No. Handcuffs."
"Pardon me."
Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table, and then he sprang up again and flung off his coat.
"Here, you stop that,"
said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat, and it struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it, and left it limp and empty in his hand.
"Hold him, once he gets the things off."
"Hold him!"
cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance, and sent him backwards into old Toothsome the sexton, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air, and incontinently he threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head.
"Look out!"
said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing.
"Hold him."
"Shut the door!"
"Don't let him loose."
"I got something. Here he is."
It was a perfect babel of noises. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, knowing... Oh, sorry, I bumped the microphone. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led the row. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henry was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and, turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Huckster in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men... Oh, sorry. In another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall.
"I've got him!"
shouted Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly toward the house door, and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight nevertheless, and making play with his knee, spun around, and fell heavily, undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "Hold him!" and "Invisible!" and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place, whose name didn't come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with that the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers still lay quite still, face upward and knees bent at the footsteps of the inn. I think we're on chapter 8. Yeah, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, I'm counting correctly. Numbers are hard. Chapter 8, in transfer. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself. And looking, he beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear with that breadth and variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going as it seemed to him in the direction of Aderdeen. I almost said Alderon, that's not right. Going as it seemed to him in the direction of Aderdeen. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquillity vanished, and he got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill toward the village as fast as he could go. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to embonpoint, his short limbs accentuated this inclination, and he wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside over the down towards Aderdeen, about 1.5 miles out of Iping. His feet, save for socks of irregular open work, were bare. His big toes were broad and pricked like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but they were too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather especially, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but he hated damp as well. He'd never properly thought out which he hated most when it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. So he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf, and looked at them. and seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He wasn't at all startled by a voice behind him.
"They're boots, anyhow," said the voice.
"They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side, regarding them distastefully. "And which is the ugliest pair in the whole blessed universe, I'm darned if I know." "I've worn worse. In fact, I've worn none, but none so audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been cadging boots in particular for days, because I was sick of them. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees a thundering lot of the boots. And if you'll believe me, I praise nothing in this whole blessed country, try as I would, but them. Look at 'em, and a good country for boots, too, in a general way, but it's just my promiscuous luck. I got my boots in this country 10 years or more, and then they treat you like this."
"It's a beast of a country, and, well, pigs for people."
"Ain't it? Oh, but them boots, it beats it."
He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots of his interlocutor with a view to comparisons, and lo! where the boots of his interlocutor should have been, there were neither legs nor boots. He was irradiated by the dawn of a great amazement.
"Where are ye?"
said Thomas Marvel over his shoulder, and coming down on all fours, he saw a stretch of empty downs with the wind swaying the remote green-pointed furze bushes.
"Am I drunk? Have I had visions? Was I talking to myself? What the—"
"Don't be alarmed."
"None of your ventriloquizing me. Where are you? Alarmed indeed."
"I made myself clear. Don't be alarmed."
"You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool. Where are you? Let me get my mark on you." "Are you buried?"
said Marvel after an interval. But there was no answer. Marvel stood, bootless and amazed, his jacket very nearly thrown off.
"Pewit,"
said a peewit very remote.
"Pewit indeed. This ain't no time for foolery."
The down was desolate, east, west, and north and south. The road with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes ran smooth and empty, north and south, and save for the pewit, the sky was empty too.
So help me, it's the drink. I might have known."
"It's not the drink. You keep your nerves steady."
"Ow!"
said Marvel, and his face grew white amidst its patches.
"It's the drink,"
his lips repeated noiselessly, and he remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards.
"I could have swore I heard a voice."
"Well, of course you did."
"It's there again,"
said Marvel, closing his eyes and clasping his hand on a brow with a tragic gesture. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently, and left more dazed than ever.
"Don't be a fool."
I'm off my chump. It's no good. It's fretting about them blarsted boots. I'm off my blessing bloomin' chump, or it's spirits."
"It's neither one thing nor the other. Listen."
"Chump."
"1 minute,"
said the voice, penetratingly, tremulous with self-control.
"Well,"
said Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest by a finger.
"You think I'm just imagination?" "Just imagination?"
"What else can you be?"
said Marvel, rubbing the back of his neck.
"Very well,"
said the voice, in a tone of relief.
"Then I'm going to throw flints at you, till you think differently."
"But where are you?"
The voice made no answer, and whiz came a flint, apparently out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Whiz it came and ricocheted from a bare toe into the ditch. Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud, and then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and came head over heels into a sitting position.
"Now,"
said the voice as a third stone curved upward and hung in the air above the tramp.
"am I imagination?"
Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment.
If you struggle any more, I'll throw the flint at your head.
It's a fair do,
said Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded toe in hand and fixing his eye on the third missile.
I don't understand. And stones flinging themselves, stones talking. Put yourself down, run away, I'm done.
The third flint fell.
It's very simple. I'm an invisible man.
Tell us something you don't know. Where you've hid, how you do it, I don't know. I'm beat.
That's all. I'm invisible. That's what I want you to understand.
Anyone could see that. There's no need for you to be so confounded impatient, mister. Now then, give us a notion. How are you hid?
I'm invisible. That's the great point, and what I want you to understand is this.
But whereabouts?
Here, 6 yards in front of you.
Oh, come on, I'm not blind. You'll be telling me next you're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps.
Well, yes, I am. Thin air. You're looking through me.
What? Ain't there any stuff to you? Vox, Ed, what is it? Jabber, is that it?
I am just a human being. Solid, needing food and drink, needing covering, too. But I'm invisible. You see, invisible. Simple idea. Invisible.
What, real like?
Yes, real.
Let's have a handy if you are real. Won't be so darn out of the way like then. Heavens, how you made me jump gripping me like that.
He felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonished.
I'm dashed if this doesn't beat bird fighting. Most remarkable. And I can see a rabbit clean 3.5 miles away. Not a bit of you visible except...
He scrutinized the apparently empty space keenly.
You haven't been eating bread and cheese?
You're quite right, and it's not quite assimilated into the system.
Sort of ghostly, though.
Of course, all this isn't half so wonderful as you think.
It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants. How'd you manage? How did this is done?
It's too long a story, and besides...
I tell you, the whole business fairly beats me.
What I want to say at present is this. I need help. I've come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering mad with rage, naked, impotent. I could have murdered, and I saw you.
Lord.
I came up behind you, hesitated, went on.
Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent.
And then stopped. Here, I said, is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me. So I turned back and came to you and...
Oh, heavens, but I'm all in a tizzy. How am I going to help you? What do you require in the way of help? Invisible?
I want you to help me get clothes and shelter, and then with other things. I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you will. Must.
Look here, I'm too flabbergasted. Don't knock me about any more, and leave me go. I must get steady a bit, and you're pretty near broken my toe. It's so unreasonable. Empty downs, empty sky, nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature, and then out comes a voice out of heaven, and stones a fist. Heavens!
Pull yourself together, you have to do the job I've chosen for you.
Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round.
I've chosen you. You're the only man except some of those fools down there who knows there's any such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power.
He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently.
But if you betray me, if you fail to do as I direct you...
He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch.
I don't want to betray you,
said Marvel, edging away from the fingers.
Don't you go and think of that, whatever you do. All I want to do is help you. Just tell me what I gotta do. Whatever you want, that I'm most willing to do.
Well, folks, I'm looking at the time. I needed to be asleep 5 minutes ago. So, this has been Paper Cuts. We'll have to see what the Invisible Man wants Mr. Marvel to do next week. Thanks for tuning in. Please go vote on Frozen Tundra Finds, especially if you just so happen to be, what's the word I'm looking for? If you just so happen to be the sort of person watching the video rather than the stream. But if you're watching the stream, I just pasted the Frozen Tundra Finds link in chat. Feel free to go vote on that. It's very important that you do. And that's about all for the recording this week. This has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.